Good evening, everybody. Welcome inside the Villanova Basketball Report. Live here on Bob Long Sports. My team, Kevin Long, Tom Trainer alongside. No K-Mac tonight. We expect him back next week. But guys, welcome and excited for a good show here. Excited to talk about, for the first time, a Big East loss that Villanova had. And we can walk through some quick issues that they had. And really, we're going to look forward in this podcast. Coming up in short fashion, this should be in your inboxes, on your iTunes feeds, and on YouTube by Wednesday morning. So tonight, it'll be a game against Marquette, a team that Villanova blew out in game one. Opportunity to move forward after a tough loss against St. John's and a game that was closer than it should have been against Georgetown. Gentlemen, how are we doing this weekend? How are we feeling about Villanova basketball?
Hey, Bob, great to be on another week of Villanova Basketball Report here. Overall, not thrilled with the past week. Obviously, the first Big East loss to St. John's was disappointing. But I think that was a really good St. John's team that we saw out there. I mean, Posh Alexander showed that he's going to be a force in this conference for years to come. And I think we saw some uncharacteristic basketball out of Villanova. I think we started out pretty well in the early portions of that game. And then we started just forcing up some bad shots. I saw a lot of bad looks from Colin Gillespie and Justin Moore. And then obviously the uncharacteristic turnovers from Colin Gillespie really hurt us down the stretch in that game. Overall, I'm not super concerned about how this team moves forward. I think it's more of a bump in the road. I was a little bit concerned to see some of the same mistakes happening again against Georgetown, but again, I think this team figures it out. I think we generally find one blip, one bad week, even in some of our championship seasons. And I think that's the case here. Now, not saying that we're necessarily there or this team is of that caliber, but I don't think that this is something that Villanova basketball cannot recover from.
Well, I think, I don't know if there's such a thing as the podcast jinx. But I mean, we had talked about turnovers and turnover margin on our last show and how that was a strength of this team led by Colin Gillespie. Well, we saw that trend hit a brick wall in a very hard way against St. John's. 17 turnovers, 6 of those by your point guard, Colin Gillespie, had only been averaging 1 a game. They've only been averaging 8 a game as a team. Now they're averaging 9, of course, after that outlier. And I think Kevin is right. I think it is exactly that. It's a bit of an outlier. As Kevin said, even in our championship seasons, I'm sure we'll talk about the 2018 team who also lost to St. John's. Even in your championship seasons, there's always a head scratcher of a game in there, right? You come into the season, you're thinking, okay, Xavier is going to give us a tough go this year. Seton Hall always does. It's Creighton this year. They're the team who's rivaling Villanova this year, but there is always a head scratcher in there, and this was it. I don't think it's a lot of cause for concern, but there are things that need cleaned up, and we can talk about that.
That's what we'll talk about in today's opening tip. Here we go. All right, boys, the first question is indeed that 2018 loss against St. John's and to this year's 2021, that is, loss against St. John's. So three years later. What loss was worse and why?
Well, I think to me the big factor was the 2018 loss was at home in the Wells Fargo Center in front of a bunch of fans, in a normal environment, and this one was up at St. John's in a very different environment, a very different year. We haven't even played in that arena since, I don't even know when exactly the date is, probably since earlier than 2000. I was more concerned. Actually, I guess I would put it 2 ways. I think that it was a bigger loss to St. John's in 2018 when we were ranked number 1 at home. And I'm a little bit more concerned about this loss, just seeing how it went down. And some of the guys on this team are not necessarily as experienced as the guys were in 2018. So I would say worst loss was 2018, but more concerning loss was this year, 2021.
Well, I think this year is both the worst and more concerning loss, and there's one main reason, and that is Shamori Pons. I mean, you knew playing St. John's back 2016, 17, 18 that you were going to have to deal with Shamori Pons, and he could go off on any given night. And we know that there's a lot of times that's how teams have beat Villanova. They have that guy Raggi who goes off, or whoever it is who goes off. When you have a player who can go off at any given night. Not saying that was necessarily Raggi. I think it was probably more Dougie McBuckets on that Creighton team, but it was Raggi that night, we all remember. The other reason I will say that this game is more concerning is the way these two games played out. If you remember that game in 2018, St. John's built a lead, largely led by Shamori Pons, and Villanova crept back in the game and nearly stole a game that they had no business winning. Well, this past week, St. John's, without a leading star scorer, was beating Villanova, one by forcing Villanova to commit dumb mistakes and turn the basketball over. That's a different way of losing. But also, Villanova never really went on a run. You were always waiting, anticipating some type of run. But they just kept committing mistake after mistake after mistake, digging themselves a hole, and really couldn't get back in the ballgame, which I think is a cause for concern.
I'll say this. I don't really care what happened in 2018. I mean, I know the question is about that 40 minutes, but the story's been written. They won the national championship, arguably the most dominant team in the 2000s of college basketball. So, yeah, it was a bad loss, but they had also, St. John's had beaten Duke that week. I'm not too worried about this one. This game, yeah, I think it's something where we've been hinting at it for weeks here. I'm begging for them to just blow a team out. And they did it against Marquette right before the stoppage due to COVID, but they just haven't blown a lot of teams out this year. And I would like to see Villanova. I think as a fan of Villanova, a fan would like to see Villanova blow out a team that is inferior to them in talent, discipline, and execution. And it hasn't happened as consistently as it should. And I don't know that necessarily the way St. John's is playing, should Villanova blow them out 7 times out of 10? I don't know. But they should win 9 out of those 10 games. And maybe this was one of the 10 that they lost. So I find it tough to compare 2018 and this one. Now, the next question we got is we're going to pull it back from Villanova a little bit and talk some Big Five. Let's talk about John Chaney, the death of John Chaney this past week, unfortunately. Was a living legend and now, unfortunately, no longer with us. But what he did with that Temple program took them all the way to number 1, made them a force nationally, and he will always be remembered for that and what he did in Philadelphia. Quick thoughts from the group on John Chaney, his legacy.
I mean, it's just a person who I think had as much impact on college basketball, not just in the Philadelphia area, but nationally, as a coach or anyone can have without having ever won a national championship or been to a Final Four. Just a man who you heard time and time again was more of a teacher of life, and a mentor for the young men that he coached, and just so gracious with his time. And his job really was his life and his passion, and that was his kids. And everybody he seemed to come in contact with in the course of his life has had great things to say about him. And just even Kevin Nagandi, I know, on ESPN, who's a proud Temple Owl, talked of his story about the first time he went to a practice as a student reporter, and John Chaney pulled him aside and had a long conversation with him, asking about where he was from and his family and stuff. So just a guy who had a great impact, clearly, on everybody who he came in contact with and everybody that knew him. And I think just from all of the outpouring of condolences and love and support and kind words you heard across the college basketball landscape, just really showed how much of an impact he had.
Yeah, clearly a guy who had earned the respect of not only just the city of Philadelphia, but the entire NCAA college basketball landscape. Truly was a legend at Temple for so many years, and for a guy to have earned the respect of really every Big Five team in Philadelphia and across college basketball really speaks to his character more so as a person than even as a head coach, although he had a great career as a head coach. But truly a devastating loss for the college basketball world. He'll be missed for a long, long time.
Yep, I would agree with all that. I would just reiterate what I said at the jump of what he did to that Temple program, how it is thought of nationally, and that he was a huge part of that. And certainly he will be missed. One of those legends in the Big Five. It's known for its great coaches. John Chaney right there at the top of the list. So from the Big Five back to the Big East, the question was this conference this year. Teams are beating each other up. Villanova was the number 3 team in the country. They dropped a little bit last week, which is interesting in its own right, honestly, because I think 6 of the top 10 teams lost this week. Nonetheless, what is the state of the Big East Conference? Is this an overrated Big East Conference from where we sat in mid-November, or is there something else at play?
I think overall this is an ideal year for Big East basketball, and the reason why I say that is because you have some of these conferences such as the ACC and the SEC, the Kentuckys of the world, who have long benefited from the one and done players. They get 5 of the top 100 players in every ranking class to come to their school. They're able to coach them up throughout the course of the year, and by March they're playing it well as a team together and they're ready to make a run. And that just has not been the MO of the Big East for a very long time. The Big East, excluding maybe Villanova in 2018, has had a lot of players who have stayed for all 4 years or at least 3 years of their career. And these teams are very good because they know how to play well together and they know each other well. So I think so far this year, the Big East is outperforming my expectations. I think, I don't think this is the case where the Big East is not a good conference, and that's why everyone's kind of falling back towards the middle. I think this really could be a big year for this conference to show out in the NCAA tournament, as long as we can get enough of our teams into the March Madness here.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Kevin, you mentioned that this might be a great year for the Big East, maybe to capitalize on something. But I don't know that they are capitalizing on something. I mean, Bob alluded to the idea of cannibalizing each other. I mean, you look down the conference standings, and I mean, after Villanova, Creighton's 10-4. Xavier has been on hiatus for a while now, and the best record you'll see is around 500. But I think that's part of what we expected this season. So I guess, Kevin, you said they've exceeded expectations this year. I would say they've met my expectations this year, which weren't very high. And I say that because, yes, we had Creighton and Marcus Zagorowski. We knew that would be a force to be reckoned with this year. The team to challenge Villanova, so to speak. Sure, there's Mamu at Seton Hall, and people were curious about UConn returning. But this year we didn't have the Xavier juggernaut. Seton Hall, not as good as they've been, and I would say maybe even underperforming as well. Providence, still a tough team, but not performing at a high level we've seen. Marquette seems to have relapsed a little bit this year. And then obviously Georgetown hasn't figured out, and Butler this year, flipping a new page and a lot of new faces on their roster. So I think this year, in some ways, you're right, Kevin. This might have been a odd year in college basketball with COVID generally. Maybe the Big East, which seems to be a consistent league, capitalizes. But I didn't expect much from this year. Didn't know what to expect this year. And now I think the question is, well, we're used to seeing, 5 or 6 teams make the NCAA tournament from the Big East. And looking at the list, now it's hard to say because you have teams like Xavier, like UConn, like in every conference, that are going to be way behind in number of games played, probably when it's all said and done. How does the committee reconcile those numbers in their decision making? But I mean, looking at this, is this only a 3-team tournament year? And do we consider that a down year? I don't know.
I think the answer is no. I think right now 6 teams have a realistic shot to get in. I think Villanova, Creighton are in. I think Xavier is in as of right now. They got to play a couple more games, but they were 7-0 out of conference, and they're third technically from a percentage standpoint at 4-2 in the Big East. I know their schedule wasn't great in the non-conference, but that's good enough to get in for me. Seton Hall at 11-8, I think they're going to be one of those either first 4 in or one of the last teams to not get a bye. Who knows what's going to happen with a team like Penn State, but I think that huge comeback by Seton Hall against Penn State is going to be enormous, with both teams kind of hanging on the edge of the bubble. UConn, I think they're in. They were just 3-0 out of conference. They're 5-4. I think they're going to find a way here. Injuries are going to be, part of the story, right? How do they finish up? And then St. John's. So they're 13-7, 7-6 in the Big East. They've won 5 straight, and they were 6-1 out of conference. I think they're in.
And now they have a huge resume booster.
No doubt. Marquette, 9-10 overall. Providence, 9-10 overall. Butler, 6-10. Right? That's where it falls off. But I think very realistic to expect that all 6 of those teams have a chance in the last month of the season here to earn their way into the NCAA tournament. So I think the answer to this question, or an answer to this question, is it's a weird year, but really it comes down to non-conference play. Non-conference play did not allow for the same matchups, the same type of scheduling that teams would normally and otherwise do. And so trying to mince and parse resumes is going to be really difficult. The other thing to think about is that, Kentucky's not going to make the NCAA tournament. UCLA is playing better, but, some of these big-time programs, obviously Kansas is going to make the tournament, but they're struggling. Duke is struggling. Duke may not make the tournament. So, the Big East doesn't look so good, but because every one of these games was, in most cases, right, most of these games were in conference, it's so much tougher to delineate, and we don't have that cross-section of reality to really identify resumes conference to conference. So that leads to our next question, which is, what happened to the Blue Bloods? Is this a 2020, 2021 thing, or is this a sign of the times going forward? Duke, North Carolina, UCLA, Kansas, Indiana, although they've been down over time, Kentucky. What's going on with the Blue Bloods?
Well, I think you guys know what I'm going to say here based on my last answer, but I think this is a blip on the radar this year. Again, these kids had no preseason to practice together with each other. Most of them just got together for the first time in October and started playing games within a week. And we've seen over the years Kentucky teams that have taken all year to come together, going into the NCAA tournament as an 8 seed, but knowing that they have all the talent in the world and they finally put it together in March. And they're one of the best teams in the nation at that point. And you put that schedule back by 3 or 4 months by not allowing these kids to practice together in the summer. I think that's truly what's happening with these Blue Bloods here right now. I fully expect that they will all be back next year, or maybe even the year after that. Maybe it takes a full another cycle for them to go through and have a full round of practice with each other before they're truly back. But I think this is just a strange year for the college basketball landscape, especially for those schools that have benefited from the one and done.
So in one sense, Kev, I'm going to agree with you. I think we made this point earlier this year on this show. It was something I had heard Urban Meyer say on a college football halftime show, which was that great teams might be hurt more because of COVID and quarantines and stoppages, because great teams thrive on habits and routine. And so when that comes into play and routines, habits get thrown off, that's going to hurt great teams maybe more than other teams, kind of counterintuitively, which was an interesting point. Obviously, I don't know that we saw that in college football season. Alabama's still in the national championship, and they're playing Clemson and Ohio State in the final in the college football playoff there. But with that said, I think there is something to your point about teams that rely on one and dones not having as much time this year to prepare with these breaks, 2 or 3 week breaks that teams have to have when they go through COVID issues, not having as much time to gel or build on the progress a Kentucky might otherwise make during the course of a season. However, I will say that I don't know that this is just a blip. When's the last time, first of all, UCLA was relevant? 2008, maybe?
Mick Cronin, though, baby. Mick Cronin. More consistent than what's it again? More consistent than a few good men on a rainy Sunday. Mr. John Rothstein.
Well, Mickey Cronin, I would say maybe he'll bring some fire and passion to Los Angeles because that's what that program might need. But Indiana, you mentioned Michigan State. I don't know if many people would say they're blue blood. They've probably been as consistent as anybody, maybe. But I think that we've seen this trend. Obviously, the buzzword in college basketball for the past decade has been parity. And I think if you look at college basketball by decade, for example, so these teams we mentioned, Duke, UNC, Kentucky, Kansas, we'll throw in Michigan State for the sake of argument because they're getting lumped in with those teams that aren't currently in the top 25. If you take a decade by decade and you look at the 90s, 6 out of those 10 teams won a national championship. You look at the next decade, first decade of the thousands, 5 out of those 10 teams won a national championship. Past decade, we just had 4 of those teams we just mentioned won a national championship. That's one less team per year. Now, I know any historian or statistician will tell you breaking things up in just chunks, arbitrary chunks like decades, will cause problems. But because there was one time, I think, 2008, 9, and 10, where those teams won 3 in a row. But with that point stated, I do wonder if this accelerates this parity process. I'm not saying there's going to be a new blue blood. I'm wondering if blue blood will exist. I'm wondering if something like COVID accelerates this process in that top recruits that might think of doing a one and done year decide, you know what, I'm going to go play my basketball overseas. I'm going to go make money for a year elsewhere. That's a better option than going to college. Who knows how much longer COVID still might be an issue next year, unfortunately. We don't know. So I just wonder if this accelerates some of those processes. I don't know if we'll see new blue bloods emerge. Like people have mentioned, when does Villanova become blue blood, for example? I don't know if we see that happen. I think maybe this accelerates the parity process that might already be happening.
Yeah, so 2 ways I'll go with this. Because you mentioned Michigan State, I happened to hear on the broadcast tonight, we're talking about Josh Langford, who's been a very good player, 1,000-point scorer for Michigan State. He's had injuries. A guy that stuck it out to his senior year. If you would have asked people his freshman year, the thought was he probably would have moved on early. That senior class right now, if nobody moved on, would have been Nick Ward, Miles Bridges, Cassius Winston. Is that any good? My goodness, right? So interesting about the one and done process and how does it affect team. Interesting enough about, did these guys not have enough time to practice this year, and is that what's going on? More veteran teams are doing better. But truly, when I look at this situation, it is a bit confounding to me because if you look at college football, for example, there has never been less parity in college football. It is 3 programs and everybody else. Now, college basketball is run by the same set of written and unwritten rules as college football. If you look at the sports economics side of it, supply, demand, constraints, the constraints that are apparent in professional sports, a draft, a salary cap, neither of those are part of the equation in college sports. Draft? No. Alabama can sign the 10 best 5-star recruits in the country if they want. No. Kentucky can sign the 4 best kids in the class for basketball if they wanted and the kids decided to go there. And so when we talk about opportunity cost, right, that's what the draft is and that's what the salary cap is. Your opportunity cost of bringing on Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence next year to duke it out for your starting quarterback position at the NFL level. The constraint there is both the draft, right? So you don't have those picks. You could trade up for one, but then you're going to have monster salaries early on. Again, that's more so for your veterans. But again, the salary cap is your constraint so that you can't bring on Aaron Donald, Patrick Mahomes, and the best receiver in the league, Stephon Diggs, let's just say, right? Or DeAndre Hopkins. So college basketball should not have true parity. It should be very similar to college football in that the opportunity cost to bring in the last guy on your roster and the first guy on your roster is exactly the same. There's no salary cap. There's no draft order. So with that as it will, why? Why is it like this? And I think it's because there's only 5 guys on the court for one. There's no bifurcation of offense versus defense. Everybody's playing the entirety of the floor. And I think it's the fact that high school basketball is so deep right now that there are enough really good players that there's not this, say, a market drop off from one year to the other. And you know what? Sometimes there's going to be 10 really good kids. Kentucky's going to get 3. Duke's going to get 2. And that's what that 4-year class, maybe 2-year, 1-year class is going to look like. And those are the teams that are really successful. Then there are other times where Kentucky thinks they have this monster recruiting class led by a guy like Quade Green from Newman Goretti. And all of a sudden, you know what? We love Quade, great kid, but he wasn't a one-and-done guy. He transferred out playing for Washington right now. And so sometimes you get the top recruits in high school, and it's that particular class, that crop of guys is not ready to go win a national championship. So I do believe it's a blip. Next year you might have it where there's a bigger drop-off amongst the top 30 or so guys, and Duke, North Carolina, Kansas, and Kentucky will get their outsized source of them. And maybe it'll be those 4 programs we're talking about next year.
Well, the one thing I will say to counter your point there, Bob, is the one constraint you're missing in basketball versus football is the years that you have to stay there. So if you're Alabama, you get the top recruits in the country that year. You know you have them for 3 years. And that's the clear difference between college basketball and college football. And we've seen Duke and Kentucky take the route of, I'm going to get the best guys knowing full well that I'm going to have to restock next year. And, you know, you see a team like Villanova who maybe takes a little bit different approach. Now, we've had Sadiq leave. We're going to see Jeremiah leave this year, most likely, maybe even a Justin Moore. So, you know, it's sort of starting to change for Villanova as well. But as a college basketball program, you need to make that decision. Am I going to go after the best guy that I think is going to be one and done, or do I take this guy that maybe is a little bit raw, but I think I can get 3, maybe 4 years out of him? So I think that's where the parity comes into play in college basketball versus college football.
Well, and it's a good point. I actually think you were really close to something else too that I'll say I didn't consider as strongly, which is the reason that Alabama – the 3 years. The 3 years isn't important because those guys are necessarily contributing all 3 years. The 3 years is important because most of those guys aren't going to play their freshman year, and they take a year or two to build up to what college athletics requires compared to high school sports. And in basketball, they don't have that luxury. Now, I could argue counter to that it's not as necessary to compete at the college level of basketball. The jump physically isn't that pronounced relative to college football. I think it is certainly pronounced, but not as much. So that's the point that I think you were really close to. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I could have and should have highlighted in my take.
I think you're both missing the main reason as to why there's the difference, and that is that basketball is growing, football is not. Parents don't want their kids to play football anymore due to concussion issues. mainly, and various other injuries, mainly concussion and everything that's happened with that over the past few years. Whereas basketball has just grown and grown and grown. And so
Do
I
you
think that
think?
the
Interesting.
talent, the talent, between a blue blood program and between name any Big East team, just isn't that great. That gap just isn't that great. I think there's just way more people playing basketball than there are playing football, and I think that gap is widening. And so I think the talent level at the top for college basketball is just that much closer, just by sheer numbers. I mean,
Interesting.
you see Duke, Kentucky, Kansas, UNC lead the recruiting rankings every year. But I'm saying that those teams and that talent isn't that much different than the talent that an Alabama is getting versus an Iowa,
Hmm.
that a Clemson is getting versus a Pitt. The talent that a Duke gets versus the talent that a Seton Hall get or a Xavier or a Creighton gets, and then compound that with the rules that Kevin just mentioned, put those two things together, and I think you have a recipe for the parity versus non-parity.
Interesting. So you think there's enough of a significance of numbers that is the driving force. Less so like that basketball programs only bring in 3, maybe 4 recruits a year, and football 25. You think it's kids just aren't playing football. More kids are
Absolutely. I mean,
playing. Interesting.
how many? I mean, we're young adults. How many of your friends have you talked to and they say, "Yeah, my kid's not going to play football." Even
Oh, for
cousins of mine,
sure. Mhm.
cousins of mine who play college football aren't going to let their kids play football.
I get it.
And I mean, Kevin's a big guy. Kev play football. I don't know, Kev. Did you play pee wee football at all?
I did not.
He
My
didn't play football.
parents did
Well,
not
and
want me
also
to
like,
play.
yeah, and I mean, how many of these guys? You can't tell me that a lot of these guys. Look at Caleb Daniels. We mentioned him being a linebacker. Javon Pinkston couldn't have been Division I football players, right? They're bigger than any defensive end you got out there. Yet here they have, and they are playing basketball instead of football. I just, not to say they didn't grow up playing football at some point, but basketball has become their sport, and I know a lot of athletes are making a basketball decision. LeBron James, it is the safer sport, and the longevity is there to play
Hmm.
basketball over football.
Very interesting. I don't. I can't say I agree that it's the biggest factor because there's still a lot of kids playing football. I think all the reasons we talked about, right? Kids getting more physically mature in their second and third year in football, making that leap versus not having the opportunity to do so in basketball. I actually think the college football playoff only being 4 teams and the reduction of the importance of other bowls, I think that's huge as well because Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State get millions of dollars of free publicity every year. Like I haven't noticed that the quality of football in college football has dropped, even amongst mid-level teams. I would argue that it's gotten increased from a parity standpoint because they've reduced scholarship levels. So Tom Osborne and Nebraska aren't grabbing 119 guys and pulling this kid who is a guy that could maybe play for him but probably won't, only so their rival at Colorado won't get him. Like that stuff isn't happening anymore. So yeah, it's not as much parity as college basketball, but I think it's more than it has been. I'll say this: at the top, it's less. In the mid, I think it's more than it has been historically.
I also think it's much more difficult in football to have a David versus Goliath situation. You think about basketball, you can have one guy on the floor out of 5 take over a game, just like we talked about the Villanova St. John's game back in 2018. You can have a Shamori Pons take over a game and win it. And the most recent example I'm going to use for football is actually the Super Bowl. You think about Patrick Mahomes, the guy is superhuman and he can take over a game at any point. But when his offensive line could not do anything and his D line's getting overpowered, there's nothing that one guy can do. And the same can be said for Alabama going up against a non-conference opponent or a bottom of the SEC opponent. Their D line is going to overpower their offensive line. If they have a stud quarterback, it's not going to make a whole bunch of a difference. So if you have all the best players in the country playing on the same team, I would say you have a better shot of beating that team in basketball than you would in football.
I think we've solved all the world's problems, guys. That's a good conversation. Very enjoyable. Good stuff. That's the opening tip here tonight. And next up, we're going to send it to our buddy Kevin Long, who's going to take us through our cat in the wild.
All right. Thanks, Bob. So today we are going to go across the big pond here. We're going to go over to Moscow for our cat in the wild, and that is Darren Hilliard. Have not heard from him in a little while, but like I said, he's playing in Moscow in the VTB United League. And he, on Sunday, scored 38 points on 11 of 17, including 6 of 11 from 3. So a really great game from him. And, one of the guys that really does not get quite the credit that he deserves for his time at Villanova. He left just before they won their national championship, but really fostered in that new culture when the team was in turmoil in those 2011, 2012 seasons, really helped turn the tides there, and, got drafted by the Pistons in 2015, but never stuck around too long. But really good to see him having a little bit of success overseas now.
Very good. Yes, Darren Hilliard, an all-timer for me, for Villanova. His senior year, he was absolutely incredible. You mentioned just missing out on that national championship team. To this day, I contend that team was every bit as good as the 2016 team. They really were. Between Javon Pinkston and Darren Hilliard, now it's kind of tough to account for how much better did Chris Jenkins get? How much better did Josh Hart get? Although he was pretty darn good the prior year. But Hart becomes an All-American. Of course, Ochefu and Arch, all those guys get a year better. But not having Darren Hilliard was also something that team was better when he was on it, right? So all things considered, Darren Hilliard, it's unfortunate that NC State loss is probably as heartbreaking of a loss as a Villanova fan can probably stomach to remember, but that team was really darn good and was a start of things to come.
Yeah, one of the sweetest and smoothest looking jump shots you will ever see, that lefty stroke of Darren Hilliard's, and I think one of the most exciting finishes to a game I've seen in my Villanova history is that three-pointer in Hinkle at Butler.
Yep.
Nice play by him and Arch to sink that three just before the buzzer. But yeah, good to see him doing well overseas. I remember he was my little sister's favorite player, and I bought her his jersey when he became a rookie on the Detroit Pistons. And she still has that jersey, and it's a big reason she's number 4 when she's playing high school basketball these days. Is Darren Hilliard. So great choice in my eyes, Kev. Glad to get a update on Darren Hilliard.
Yeah, an under-recruited kid, huh? Those blue bloods. Go ahead, take your 5 stars. We'll take Darren Hilliard out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he'll become a stud by his senior year. Good stuff there, Kevin. All right, so no K-Mac tonight. I think we're going to put a pause on our trivia unless anybody has anything they'd like to throw at us right now.
Couldn't think of one.
Yeah, we'll get him next week. K-Mac falling asleep at the wheel. But on to the shoot-around.
Yeah, all right, Bob. Time for the shoot-around. It's our weekly shout-out moment where we shoot out anything, or shout out anything, rather, from Villanova basketball world or Philadelphia basketball world, or nothing to do with basketball at all. But this week I am going to start with something we've already mentioned in the show, which is on the hearts and minds of all Philadelphians and everybody in the college basketball world, and that is the passing of John Chaney. And John Chaney, somebody who is dear to my heart and my memories as a child, when I was growing up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Quincy Watley was a star on that 2001 Temple team that went to the Elite Eight until they fell to eventual national champions Michigan State. was from our parish in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and his family would organize bus trips a few times a year to come down to the Liacouras Center in Philly from Harrisburg to watch Quincy play. And I'll never forget after the game, seeing Coach Chaney mingle with people and chat, even after a heated game. And it's interesting. I know my father, who does not tend to take a liking to coaches who are extra fiery on the sidelines or seem to have the mouth of a sailor at times, but for whatever reason, he always liked John Chaney. And anytime he saw that tie, come undone and that jacket get thrown off, and he'd be sweating as much as any of his players on the court. You just see the passion in his eyes. And so to hear, to know all of that and to hear players speak so highly of him after his passing, especially Quincy Watley, who I think I said something pretty profound, who was quoted as saying, you can see in the sons of the players that John Chaney coached, you can see their kids, so their sons playing today, and you can see the lessons that John Chaney taught their fathers in the way their kids play. None more so than Jalen Brunson. And so I thought that said a lot about John Chaney and his lasting legacy through his players and their kids.
That's a great story, Tom. I am going to go a little different route. I'm going to shout out the Loyola Chicago Sister Jean Ramblers for being ranked for the first time in 35 years. Now, everyone remembers their great tournament run, which led them to the Final Four in 2018, but they were never actually ranked. Obviously, they were an 11 seed going into that, so had not eclipsed that mark, but now they are ranked, and they have a big doubleheader coming up this weekend against Drake, who was ranked just last week before their loss to Valparaiso. So big matchup in the Missouri Valley here. You got a one-loss Drake team going up against a three-loss Loyola Chicago team. So if you're in the market for some mid-major college basketball action, that is the matchup to watch this weekend. Really excited to see these two teams go at it, and we may end up with two Missouri Valley Conference tournament teams at the end of the day here.
Good stuff there, Kevin. My shout out today, I'm going to take us to the high school basketball ranks. And those of you that follow us pretty closely here at Bob Long Sports know that we broadcast a lot of high school sports, football for LaSalle, basketball for LaSalle as well. We do some college stuff. A lot of that is put on pause. D3 and some hockey stuff is put on pause at the college level. But what I have seen this year and how schools have been able to very quickly pivot and put a streaming service in place for all of their games and for the parents of the kids, it has been phenomenal. Special shout out to those schools that are doing it for free and offering it to folks to watch for free. I think that's very important. I've been long saying if every school had a broadcast, the game would be spread tenfold. And that's including when there are fans in the stands. But Philadelphia Catholic League basketball, for example, and we'll winnow it down there, is special. And the ability to watch these kids that are eventually going to go play for Villanova and Kentucky and the University of Miami and these other types of schools nationally, it's really great to be able to watch them play at a high school level. The Catholic League is one of the best leagues in the country, bar none. So I give a lot of those schools credit. Again, special shout out to those that are doing it for free for the benefit of their constituents and constituents beyond. It's a weird year for us. We're not able to go on the road and broadcast the various LaSalle games because of personnel and 10% capacity, and we totally get that. We look forward to meeting more of our colleagues when they come on the road to broadcast for their constituents at LaSalle, and when we go on the road to broadcast in their building for the LaSalle constituency. But I watched Archbishop Carroll host LaSalle, and they had a student-run broadcast that was really, really good. And I think that's the future. COVID maybe thrust us in a little quicker than anybody was comfortable with. but I tip my hat to the ADs of these schools, and I look forward to the future where, yeah, you know what, Newman Grade against Wood, it might be sold out in the future, but you're going to be able to watch it on a stream and hopefully a free one. I think that's great for everybody involved, specifically the kids and specifically for the Philadelphia Catholic League. All right, boys. So there's our show here tonight. Any thoughts before we get out of here?
No more thoughts for me. I'm all out of thoughts.
Tapped
Bob.
out.
Oh, thought it out. Just looking forward to hopefully a full slate of Villanova basketball games this week. Knock wood. Hope I didn't just jinx it, but looking forward to more Villanova basketball.
Kevin Long, Tom Trainer with us here on the Villanova Basketball Report. K-Mac out fishing. He'll be back next week. Enjoy, everybody.